I am Margaret Lewis, 62 years old, and on the night of my son's wedding in Savannah, I discovered just how disposable I was in his eyes. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, the string quartet played a waltz, and guests raised their glasses in celebration. I stood near the head table, clutching my champagne flute, proud in a quiet way, even if I had not been given much of a role in planning this day. It was enough to see my son, Ethan, smiling in his tuxedo, a vision of the boy I once held against my chest when the world seemed far kinder. When he rose to give his toast, I leaned forward, heart pounding with hope. Maybe tonight, after years of silence and strained exchanges, I would hear words that bridged the distance between us. His voice carried across the room, charming and steady, and then, in a single cruel sentence, he sliced through me. My mother, she's nothing but human trash. For a second, the clinking glasses froze mid-air. Laughter died on lips. The music faltered. My chest tightened as if someone had tied a cord around it and pulled hard. Heat burned my cheeks, but I would not cry here. Not in front of them. I set the glass down carefully, as though nothing had been said, and smoothed the front of my dress. My heels clicked softly against the marble as I walked out, the weight of every eye heavy on my back. Behind me, the laughter rose again, forced and brittle, as though nothing had happened. Out in the cool night air, the Spanish moss swayed under the lantern strung along the veranda. I drew a long breath, steadying myself. This was not the first betrayal, though it was the loudest. Ethan thought he had ended me with those words. What he did not know was that I had already begun a quiet calculation. I had watched, listened, and waited long before this night. And if he wanted to bury me with his insult, I would let the truth do the digging instead. After leaving the wedding hall that night, memories of how we had reached this place crowded in like unwelcome guests. Ethan had not always been so cruel. Once, he was the boy who ran to me with scraped knees and questions about the stars. But everything shifted when my marriage collapsed. His father, bitter and spiteful, whispered half-truths into Ethan's ears, painting me as the one who walked away from family duty. I remember standing on the porch of our old house in South Carolina, suitcase in hand, watching Ethan glare at me through the screen door. He was only 15, but the resentment in his eyes carried the weight of an adult's judgment. I wanted to tell him that leaving wasn't abandoning, that sometimes survival demanded distance, but the words fell flat against his silence. His father made sure the narrative was sealed before I could even try. Still, I never stopped providing. When tuition bills arrived from his college in Atlanta, it was my checks that cleared them. Rent deposits, medical insurance, even the small extras, those came from my second job tutoring teenagers after long school days. I sent the money quietly, never expecting gratitude, only hoping that perhaps he would sense my presence in the stability it gave him. But each phone call I attempted ended quickly, often with Ethan's clipped voice saying, "I'm busy, Mom." Sometimes he didn't answer at all. Birthdays passed with short texts or none at all. And yet I kept writing his name in the memo line of every check, as though it might tether us together. By the time he met Camilla, the young woman who would become his bride, I thought perhaps the ice between us might thaw. For a fleeting moment, it almost seemed true. When Ethan first introduced me to Camilla, I felt a cautious kind of relief. She was bright, confident, already carving her way through law school in Savannah. The three of us met for dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place where candles flickered low and the waiters poured wine as if it were ceremony. For the first time in years, Ethan's hand rested lightly on my shoulder when he said, "Mom, this is Camilla." That single gesture cracked something open in me, a glimpse of the boy who used to tug at my sleeve for reassurance. Camilla spoke with polished charm. She asked about my teaching, about the books I loved, about Ethan's childhood. I found myself laughing, answering, enjoying the rhythm of conversation. That night I went home with my heart oddly lighter, imagining that perhaps she would be the bridge to draw Ethan back to me. For a while, it seemed possible. Camilla invited me to brunches, and Ethan tolerated my presence with a civility I hadn't known in years. We talked about family recipes, about her parents in Miami, about wedding dreams. But then, slowly, the tone shifted. Conversations turned toward financial stability, joint accounts, retirement plans. She began to slip questions into the flow. Do you still carry life insurance? Margaret, what kind of estate planning have you considered? I tried to answer politely, telling myself it was normal curiosity. Yet one evening, as we cleared the dishes at my kitchen table, I overheard her murmuring to Ethan when she thought I'd stepped into the pantry. Her voice was cool, almost clinical. Love's negotiable when money's involved. The words cut deeper than she realized. I stood frozen, holding a jar of sugar, my pulse hammering in my ears. In that instant, I knew something darker lurked beneath her bright smile. The weeks after that night carried an uneasy weight. I tried to brush aside Camilla's words, telling myself that young people sometimes speak carelessly, but suspicion has a way of settling in the bones, refusing to be ignored. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan stopped by my house to drop off some mail. He left his briefcase near the sofa while he fetched a drink from the kitchen. As I gathered the envelopes he had set aside, a folder slipped out and spread across the carpet. Legal documents spilled like a quiet confession. My eyes caught on the bold heading, Durable Power of Attorney. Camilla's name was written neatly on the line beside Ethan's signature. Another document listed her as the beneficiary of a new life insurance policy, one I had never heard about. I skimmed further, my hands trembling as though the papers carried heat. The language was dry, legalistic, but the implication rang clear. Camilla's security depended on Ethan's assets, and she intended to secure them as tightly as possible. I snapped the folder shut just as Ethan walked back into the room. He didn't seem to notice my stiff posture, only joked about how messy his paperwork had become. I forced a smile, my throat dry, and handed the file back. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from recognition. This was no longer about careless remarks. It was a pattern, a plan woven carefully in ink and signatures. That evening, I sat by my window, the documents replaying in my mind. The oak trees outside cast long shadows across the lawn, and I realized I had reached a turning point. I could no longer pretend ignorance. Whatever was happening between Ethan and Camilla, it was bigger than strained family bonds. If I wanted clarity, I would need to seek it beyond the walls of my own home. I had never imagined myself walking into a private investigator's office, but desperation has a way of pushing you into unfamiliar places. The office was tucked above a hardware store downtown, with blinds half drawn and the faint smell of old coffee lingering in the air. The man who introduced himself as Daniel Price looked more like a tired accountant than a detective, which somehow reassured me. I told him, carefully, that I needed clarity about my son's fiancée. I spoke softly, as though admitting the truth too loudly might make it more real. He nodded without judgment, scribbled notes in a small pad, and promised discretion. When I handed him the retainer, my hands trembled, not from fear of exposure, but from the enormity of what I was doing, turning the spotlight on my own child's future. 2 weeks later, Daniel slid a thin envelope across the table at a quiet diner. I opened it with a steady breath and found photographs inside. Camilla, walking into a hotel lobby at night. Camilla again, leaving hours later with a man whose hand brushed hers too familiarly. Receipts followed, meals, drinks, even a weekend reservation made under her maiden name. But the file didn't stop with her. Daniel had traced financial transfers, Ethan moving large sums from a shared account into one listed solely in his name. He wasn't protecting me. He wasn't even protecting Camilla. He was protecting himself. The truth was suddenly sharp and cold. My son and his bride-to-be were bound together by convenience and calculation, not by trust. I closed the envelope and slid it back into my purse, my face unreadable even to myself. That night, as I drove home along the river, I realized something vital. I didn't need to confront them yet. The truth had already taken root. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to let it bloom. The night of the wedding shimmered with chandeliers and polished marble, but beneath the glitter, I felt like a guest in my own child's life. Camilla's family filled the front rows with chatter and laughter, while I was seated at the edge, close enough to watch, but far enough to feel invisible. I told myself it didn't matter. It was Ethan's day, not mine. When he rose for his toast, I leaned forward, heart hopeful. For a moment, he smiled my way, and I thought perhaps there was still a sliver of love left to claim. Then came his words, delivered with perfect calm and an edge that sliced straight through me. My mother, she's nothing but human trash. The room gasped. A fork clattered against porcelain. I felt every face turn toward me. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I set my glass down gently, smoothed my dress, and walked out with measured steps. No tears, no protests, just the sharp rhythm of my heels echoing in the stunned silence. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the salt of the nearby river. I leaned against the railing, gripping the wood until my knuckles whitened. My phone buzzed in my clutch. For a long moment, I stared at the screen, seeing the name of an old friend, now my attorney. My thumb hovered, then pressed. "It's time," I whispered when he answered. My voice did not shake. From inside, the music swelled again, as if nothing had happened, but something had shifted. Not just in the room I left behind, but in me. Ethan thought he had silenced me forever with those words. Instead, he had opened the door I'd been holding shut. The night was no longer his celebration. It had become the moment I let the truth step forward. The morning after the wedding, I woke before dawn. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it knows what you are about to do. I brewed a pot of coffee, carried the mug to my desk, and opened the drawer where I kept my files. The neat rows of folders, bank statements, insurance policies, retirement accounts, looked less like paperwork and more like lifelines I'd been feeding Ethan for years. One by one, I began to sever them. I called the insurance company first, my voice steady as I removed his name from every policy. Next came the financial advisor, who listened as I canceled authorizations and redirected accounts back solely under mine. Each confirmation number I wrote down felt like a nail sealing a door. There would be no more unacknowledged checks, no more safety nets for him to fall back on. By mid-morning, I turned to the final step. On my computer screen, a new email sat in draft. The sender line was hidden, the subject short. "For your eyes only." Attached were copies of the documents Daniel had given me, records of Ethan's secret transfers, photographs of Camilla's late-night meetings. I kept my message simple, stripped of emotion. Trust is a currency. Spend it carefully. My finger hovered above the send button for a long breath. Then I clicked. The screen blinked, and the email vanished into the digital ether. Leaning back, I exhaled slowly, a tremor running through me. I had not shouted in that ballroom, had not hurled accusations. Instead, I had chosen silence sharpened into action, somewhere across town. Camilla's phone would soon light up, and when it did, the foundation of her marriage would begin to crumble. The brunch was meant to be a celebration, a gentle easing into married life. The restaurant overlooked Forsyth Park, sunlight pouring through tall windows onto white tablecloths and champagne flutes. Guests chatted idly about the ceremony, about honeymoons, about the future. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. My presence lingered there in ways no one could see. Camilla arrived in a cream dress, her smile polished but brittle. She sat beside Ethan, who reached for her hand as though nothing had shifted since the vows. But when the waiter cleared the first course, she pulled a folder from her bag and set it on the table. The sound of it landing was louder than the clink of silverware. "What's this?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. She didn't answer at first, only opened the folder and slid a page toward him. Bank transfers, highlighted in yellow, his own signature glaring back. Another sheet followed, photographs of her at the hotel, copies she hadn't expected to see in anyone else's hands. Color drained from her face, but her composure never faltered. "This," she said calmly, "is proof that we built something on lies. I won't share accounts with you. I won't build a future on deception. As of today, I'm freezing what's mine and seeking counsel to end this." The table fell into silence. Relatives stared, whispers stirring at the edges like wind through dry leaves. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists on the linen. Camilla gathered the papers, slipped them back into the folder, and rose. "Enjoy your brunch," she said quietly, before walking out into the bright Savannah sun. At that table, surrounded by witnesses, Ethan was left exposed, and though I wasn't there to watch, I could feel the weight of the collapse as surely as if I had been seated across from him. News spreads quickly in a city like Savannah, where reputations rise and fall with the tide. Within days of the brunch, whispers reached the firm where Ethan worked. Clients who had once praised his sharp instincts now questioned his integrity. Contracts were quietly reassigned. Calls went unanswered. By the end of the month, his supervisor asked him to clear his desk. Officially, they cited downsizing. Everyone knew better. Camilla moved fast. She filed for separation, closed the joint account, and returned to her parents' home in Miami. The glossy photographs of their honeymoon that had been promised never appeared. Instead, there were documents, legal filings with language as cold as the marble steps of the courthouse. Ethan tried to hold on to his circle of friends, but loyalty proved fragile. Invitations stopped coming. Messages slowed until they stopped altogether. The same people who had laughed at his jokes at the reception now avoided eye contact when they passed him on the street. One evening, I drove past an apartment complex on the edge of town. Through the lit window of a second-story unit, I glimpsed him, my son, sitting alone at a bare table, his shoulders slumped, his face pale under the glow of a single lamp. The sight pierced me, not with triumph, but with something heavier. I parked down the street for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. This was the man who had called me trash in front of hundreds, now stripped of the world he thought he controlled. And yet, even in that moment, I felt no urge to gloat. The truth had done its work far better than any revenge I could have spoken aloud. In the days that followed, I found myself driving past Ethan's apartment more often than I intended. I never stopped to knock, never rang his bell. Instead, I watched from the quiet anonymity of my car. Sometimes he stood at the window, staring out with a hollow gaze, a man suddenly aware of how fragile the scaffolding of his life had been. One evening, I brought a letter. I wrote it in longhand, the way I used to sign notes for his teachers when he was a boy. My words were measured, deliberate, stripped of reproach. The truth was never meant to destroy you, Ethan. It was meant to reveal what you were becoming. Only you can decide if that is who you wish to remain. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and walked to his building. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and loneliness. At his door, I placed the envelope on the welcome mat and hesitated, my fingers brushing the wood as though memory itself might open it. For a fleeting moment, I imagined him finding it, opening it, letting the words sink in. But I didn't linger. I turned and walked away, my heels echoing down the narrow corridor. Outside, the evening sky stretched pink and gold over the river, a reminder that the world moved on, indifferent to private tragedies. I drove home with a strange peace settling in my chest. The choices were his now, not mine. I had done what I could, not to save him, not to punish him, but to leave him with the only thing I had left to give, the truth. Weeks passed, and the echoes of the wedding night faded into the rhythm of ordinary days. My house grew quiet again, filled with the steady hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Yet the silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt chosen, a space I had carved out for myself. One afternoon, I opened an old box from the attic. Inside lay photographs, some yellowed with time. I paused on one of Ethan as a child, his hair sunlit, his smile wide as he clutched a kite we had flown together on the beach. I pressed the photo to my chest, not with longing, but with acceptance. That boy would always be part of me, even if the man he became had cut me down with words I will never forget. Standing by the window, I watched the Savannah River bend and glitter under the late sun. Life flowed forward, carrying secrets, betrayals, and reckonings in its current. I understood then that my strength had never been in fighting louder than the insults hurled my way. It had been in knowing when to withdraw, when to let truth speak for itself. People often imagine justice as thunderous, dramatic, final. For me, it arrived quietly, in frozen accounts, in broken vows, in the slow crumble of a life built on lies. Justice was not my victory to savor, but his burden to face. I breathed deeply, letting the weight lift from my shoulders. Family can wound, money can corrupt, but truth will always surface. And sometimes, the fiercest act of love is not shielding someone from consequence, but stepping aside and allowing them to meet it head on. The river kept moving, and so did I. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.